The title of this paper references the core premise of the Heart Sutra, the most widely known and recited of all texts in Mahayana Buddhism. The complete statement of the initial premise, as invoked by that text, is that which is form is emptiness, that which is emptiness, form. So it's a twofold kind of statement there. Emptiness in this case, which comes into Japanese and into the United States, into North America, and Europe for that matter, by way of a kind of a Sino-Japanese formulation of shiki, which originates in Sanskrit as shunyata, translates roughly as plenum emptiness. Here signifies a radical twofold intention. On the one hand, to affirm moment-to-moment relationship with the world at hand, and on the other, to negate the sense of an enduring, separate self. Emptiness here does not imply any sort of nihilistic vacuum or existentialist angst. The implication, rather, is to suggest an absence of the content of ego. Emptiness thus affirms a living fabric of interdependent particularities and bears striking resemblance to the Jesuit watch phrase of finding God in all things. This paper grows in one respect from an intuition that there is something akin to music in the performance of Zen practice. In the course of attending silent retreats over a number of years, I've observed that the cycles of daily practice can be apprehended as something like a large work in which participants engage in a schedule of training that is regulated primarily by the sound of instruments rather than by verbal instruction. I can also recall the frequent bargings in of my own thinking mind on what might otherwise be a sense of continuity between those sounds, especially when they're separated by relatively short intervals of silence. In a spirit of parallel inquiry, then, this paper also seeks to discover ways of listening that are consistent with and furthering of the objectives of Zen that might be revealed by the methods of phenomenology. In the 15th centuries, since its more or less documented origin, Zen has evolved into a communal practice that by its nature and by consensus is intended to sublimate individuality. Robes are uniform, sleeping and eating are communal, and work is undertaken in view of its value to the community. It comes as no surprise then that spoken language, which by its nature affirms an objective world that is distinct from a subjective self, spoken language is largely absent during periods of strict formal practice. Although monks do not take a vow of silence, verbal communication outside of that which is required to sustain the infrastructure of the practice community is limited only to what is essential. What comes of this is a kind of silence that, as Cage remarks, is not silence at all. Silence that enters into the sounds that enter into the delimited silence of the practice cycle become the oral counterpart of the title of the paper references here, that which is emptiness is form. The value of silence as a reinforcement of Zen teaching on the one hand poses an obvious problem to the coordination of communal practice on the other. The solution arrived at over centuries to coordinating communal practice is this lexicon of sounds and sound patterns that are presented on a variety of wood and metal instruments throughout the day and throughout the week, and the season, the training periods are roughly 3 months long. Representations of these instruments are incorporated within drawings by the late Zen priest Sato Gie. These depict, this is a wonderful set of drawings that were discovered after this person passed away. He was a monk, and he was while he was a monk, he was depicting the life of the monk in these drawings that are very endearing, and you notice characters throughout them that are consistent. They look like cartoons, but he's consistent in his representation of his colleagues. But I'm not going to call too much attention to that. I'm calling attention primarily to the instruments. This is the mokuhan. Also, the kaihan is a particular application of it, in this case announcing the dawn. It's a large wooden board. It's hit with a pretty substantial hammer, as you can see from the person who's holding it in this case. Another suspended instrument is the mopan, which is in the kitchen, or at least near the kitchen, and it calls the group to breakfast in this case, but it also is a call to lunch. Dinner is another instrument. Because in Buddhist tradition, dinner isn't really dinner. You're not supposed to. That goes way back to India. A third slide shows the large double-headed drums a hokku, which calls the monks to the daily talk during an intensive 7-day retreat. This happens once a day in the morning. And also in this slide, there's you see here, this is the leader, the person who's a very stern sort of looking fellow, who's carrying a handle-mounted small bell that's called the kin, that he uses to signal all kinds of things. In this case, he's signaling the entrance, the arrival into the chanting hall. This is a very short, compact representation of a rather substantial instrumentarium from which these sounds originate in the course of the day. To say something then about the experience of emptiness, which also is referred to in the title. The primacy of meditation in Zen practice is manifest in the word Zen itself, tracing back through Chinese Chan, Sanskrit jhana, and all of these words which translate as meditation. Sitting meditation, zazen in Japanese, allows for concentration on the manner in which a subjective self, as well as the constitutive thoughts, recollections, and effective activity of that self can be observed as thus coming and thus passing away. And the Sanskrit for those two formulations is Tathagata and Tathagata, and those are names of the Buddha, thus coming, thus passing away. Buddhism posits that these two activities of consciousness operate simultaneously and themselves derive from shunyata, the plane of emptiness referred to previously, as their fundamental underlying source. Obaku, who is known actually originally in China as Huangpo, a 9th century one of the heavies back then, describes emptiness as, quote, the arena within which light and darkness drive each other out and alternately prevail. Understood in this way, emptiness is not synonymous with a lack of light, nor by extension with nihilism, as some people will attribute to that concept. It is rather more akin to the sky, in which light and dark play out. I'd like to now sort of, in the spirit of phenomenology, describe three phenomenologies of silence in the practice environment of Rinzai Zen. The first of these is zazen, sitting meditation. In zazen, the principal considerations of upright posture, attention to breathing, and mental concentration interpenetrate through practice over time. The scholar monk Katsuki Sekita, for example, describes, quote, a physiology of attention through which breathing exerts a governing influence on the thinking mind during zazen. In my early days of Zen practice, keeping track of these considerations, and there are more things to account for, the kind of little subsets of things, it seemed like a recurring checking things off on a list, almost as if I was making regular rounds and monitoring the pressure gauges of a steam plant. The process through which these monitorings become aspects of one activity requires time and patience. To signal preparation for zazen, the meditation leader, or as he's known, he or she is known in Japan as the jikijitsu, sounds a single stroke of the handle-mounted kin bell that allows students and monks about a half minute, though not uncommonly less, to assume and settle into the posture of meditation. It sounds very much like this. If I can get it to sound. After that initial preparation, 3 strokes of the kin bell mark the start of an interval of time. That is the silence of meditation. And for the duration of the sitting, each student directs attentional focus to tending to the considerations that I've named already, moving minimally, if at all. Perceived as a marker for the start of the meditation practice, the sound of the kin presents as a background phenomenon. Directing noetic focus toward the sound itself is another perceptual possibility. As demonstrated by Don Eide in his exegesis and extension of Husserl's analysis of time consciousness, 3 distinct foreground modifications of perception are possible. In the first instance, I can modify my perception of the sound by focusing on the onset or source point. In the second instance, I can accomplish the modification by focusing on the running out or trailing off of the sound. I can also direct my attention in a third way to a broad or open focus that extends throughout the perceptual field. In this case, the running off of sound enriches rather than occludes the perception of its onset. This predicts for a stretching of the temporal field, I'm borrowing language from Don Heide here, that in turn holds experiential aspects in common with what Nishitani, Keiji Nishitani, who was he had a correspondence with Heidegger, describes as a bottomless present, a usage that he intends as synonymous with the activity of awakening, which in Japanese is called kensho. I propose to consider further this noetic broadening in the section that follows shortly, entitled That Which is Emptiness Form. A second kind of silence, walking. At several points within the practice cycle of a single day, the group walks formally in step and in single file from one location within the temple perimeter to another. The first such transit occurs well before dawn, when after a brief service of tea in... Oh, did I not show you the big bell? I'm sorry, there's the big bell. that's a humdinger, and that sounds the evening service. This is the service of tea. This is the first thing that happens in the Zendo. And this is another kind of silence that surrounds that service. There's signals that announce the beginning of it and that signal the end of it. And in the course of it, it's moving along. You can see he's serving two people at once. They go pretty fast. This guy, if you ever see the book, it's called Unsui. Just keep an eye on him. He's doing always some really interesting things. To signal preparation, the leader sounds the kin bell. This now heading out after tea. The leader sounds the kin bell first with a single stroke, then a double stroke, and then an accelerating roll that we talked about yesterday. Within the time between the onset of the roll and its culmination in silence, all transition from a sitting to a standing posture with hands palm to palm. At another sounding of the bell, that's the time to exit and to go out, stand alongside the Zendo building, and once the line is complete, the leader sounds the kin again, and with the first step sets the line in motion towards the chanting hall, or hondo. Entering into the silence and providing its ambient signature, as Cage might have called it, is the sound of the line walking in step on the gravel path. The trailing off of the kin overlaps the first 10 or 15 seconds of walking and is easy to hear since everyone is moving towards the point from which the sound continues to reverberate, finally, of course, giving itself up into silence. At a point halfway between the Zendo and the chanting hall, the kin sounds again, with the ring trailing off as before into the sound of feet in step on the gravel of the path. As the line approaches the chanting hall, the kin sounds again, and then again as the leader enters the room. Now the line turns toward an area in which sitting cushions are arrayed in rows of 4 or 5 for the chanting service. Once everyone has arrived at the cushion, guess what? Another sounding of the kin, which is the signal for all to sit in preparation for the service. The service is an exception to the general rule of quiet. Large instruments signal and accompany an energetic style of chanting that resembles Benedictine recto tono, single pitch. And one of the texts of this service is the Heart Sutra, the one that's referenced in the title. After the service, a single stroke of the kin again signals for all to stand, then another to exit the hall and form a line outside. And as with the transit to the chanting hall, so the return to the Zendo, beginning, midpoint, proximate arrival, entry, and moment in which all have arrived at their sitting place are marked by a single stroke of the kin. The strokes of the kin in this case can be described as having a kind of locating function, marking the beginning and ending, as well as intermediate points in the transit between the two points within the perimeter of the temple. Perceived in this way, these are foreground events. A reversal of that perception brings the walking inflected silence into noetic focus and invites, moreover, a broadening of the perceptual field. In the case of a seasoned practitioner, this broadening could extend to encompass the complete interval between successive soundings of the kin. A third silence, sanzen. Sanzen is a one-on-one meeting of teacher or roshi and student. The duration of the meeting is marked off by 2 instruments of contrasting size and timbre, both metal, but rather different in terms of their tessitura, you might say. One is a small handheld bell with an internally suspended metal clapper that sounds when shaken. The other is a suspended bell inverted, which inverted would hold about a quart, and sounds when struck with a small wooden hammer. The teacher, who's seated in the sanzen room, rings the small bell to signal the end of an interview with a previous student. The student who's waiting at the bell which is at a short remove from the Sanzen room and seated with a hammer close at hand, rings twice to signal both having heard the teacher's bell and readiness to engage in the one-on-one. The length of the interview is, by contrast with most other events within the practice cycle, of indeterminate duration. Thus, the waiting student listens with a high level of expectation. Silence, in this case, is charged with protensive anticipation toward the inevitable but unknown until occurring moment in which the trill of the teacher's bell will sound. The double report of the suspended bell is a rare opportunity in the daily practice cycle to manifest one's individually identifiable self through sound. In fact, it's unique in that respect. As such, it enables the teacher to gauge the bearing of the student even before the student enters the physical interview space. With a single trilling of the handheld bell, the roshi sets in motion a rotation by which one student exits and another enters the Sanzen room. This twofold entrainment provides experiential reinforcement of the teaching that coming and going are one activity. In common with the accelerating role, as I talked about yesterday a little bit, this is an instance of teaching embodied in sound with no dependence on words or letters. And this is a high criterion in Zen. Now, I'd like to say something about that which is emptied as form, and that's a kind of a way into the interpretation, which is, in a sense, the argument of the paper. David Sudnow's Ways of the Hand, a rewritten account, is an analytical and not infrequently poetic narrative of his efforts, both to become fluent as a jazz keyboard musician and to construct a phenomenology of that experience. In a narrative that acknowledges his debt to Merleau-Ponty, Sudnow describes a process through which effort over time reveals what he calls ways of travel of the hand over and above a concern with particular notes. He comes to realize, quoting again, a joint knowing of voice and fingers, going there together. At one point, he offers the evocative description of a terrain nexus of hand and keyboard, whose surfaces had become known as the surfaces of tongue, teeth, and palate are known to each other. Such a striking metaphor that evokes the close intimacy of distinct particular things. Sudnow here recognizes the affinity of his experience of perception with that described by Merleau-Ponty for a subject at a different sort of keyboard. Quoting from Phenomenology of Perception, the subject who learns to type literally incorporates the space of the keyboard into his or her bodily space. To invoke these perceptual gestalts in the context of Zen training, consider a student subject who learns to incorporate the structure of practice and the silences articulated within that structure into his or her own bodily perceived temporal space or stance. To the extent that the incorporation is authentic, the subject can be said to have entered into a kind of figure ground reversal of what would correspond to Husserl's natural attitude. In phenomenological terms, the empty intentionalities of perceived silence become indistinguishable from the sound-articulated structure of practice. Hakuin, whose dates roughly correspond to those of J.S. Bach, he lived a little longer, but he was in Japan too, describes the experience as a turnabout. In characteristically vivid language, he describes this as an experience in which we, quote, shatter the projection that a seer and a scene, a man who feels the cold and the weather that is cold, are the way things are rather than the way they are thought to be. To summarize the argument in sort of intercultural terms here, the structure of the practice environment or phenomenal field, together with a practicing subject or body schema, in this way come to constitute a unity or terrain nexus that instantiates the experience of no self or kensho. In this regard, Hakuin cites a haiku of Basho. No one walks along this path this autumn evening. Silence is the best exegesis of that. To conclude, this paper is proposed to investigate whether form, as the purely sound-articulated structure of the practice environment of Zen, can awaken emptiness as a no-self modality of communion with the world. In effect, whether the teaching is embedded in the means through which the practice structure is articulated. While this proposition in no sense contradicts the spirit of Zen practice, foregrounding it is non-traditional. Implicit here is an inquiry of whether the objectives of Zen practice are furthered through application of methods that are identified with phenomenology, especially as these can be applied to the perception of silence in the training environment and sound articulated silences in ways that that I've described. In more respects than one, this inquiry is preliminary. This conference alone is a rich source of additional models and methodologies to consider, and I bow to all of us, to all of you for this fabulous opportunity. In particular, I foresee incorporating the methods and approaches in fieldwork of critical phenomenology that Harry talks about. Another turn that is hinted at in the paper is toward the confluence of phenomenology and consciousness studies. Evan Thompson is widely regarded as a leading voice in this emerging field. In a recent interview, he offers a critique of contemporary directions in neuroscience that are instructive for the purposes of this investigation. In particular, he offers an analogy that challenges the notion that the mind is in the brain. This, says Thompson, is like saying flight is in the wings of a bird. The mind, he says, and in this gathering he would be preaching to the choir, the mind is relational. It's a way of being in relation with the world. You need a brain, just as the bird needs wings. What's important, however, in a larger sense, is not just what's inside of the brain, but what the brain is inside of. And for Thompson, it is within the larger space of the body and culture that we find mind and meaning. Neurophenomenology, phenomenological ethnomusicology, and Zen all hold promise as avenues towards seeing, hearing, and more generally apprehending things as they are. Merleau-Ponty hints at the ethical imperatives of this project in the closing paragraphs of Phenomenology of Perception, where he urges that we direct our efforts and our attention in such a way that we become the others and in so doing become the world. Dogen, one of the great teachers in the history of Zen, who lived in 13th century Japan, anticipated this formulation. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to become illuminated by the 10,000 things. And I have just two little slides as a postscript here, if I could just... This is that same artist's impression of Kensho, or enlightenment, in the hand of the Buddha. And in some sense, the practice environment could also be, this could be a metaphor for the practice environment as well. And then the cartoon artist, Dan Wilson, has a comment on the experience of Zazen. He depicts it's an apocryphal dialogue, but no doubt it has substance, basis, in fact, between a novice acolyte and an old hand. Yeah. The caption is, "Nothing happens next. This is it." Thank you very much.